I figured out his identity through some digging online. I didn't know much about him at first, but that changed quickly. I looked through Google to try to find social media accounts, public records, and browsed websites that gave free background checks. I started following him everywhere he went, keeping detailed notes of his activities. I documented his routines, his interactions, and even the shady places that he hung around often. It was a dangerous game, but I was determined to put an end to this. Following this man was difficult, considering he was stalking my every move first. I noticed he had a pattern to his movements, a precise way that he went about his day that made it easy to predict where he'd be and when. I followed him to work, to the bars he drank at, and even to his home. I'd park a block away and watch from a distance, my heart pounding every time he looked in my direction. I started noticing that he was actually a rather sad individual, with no family and no real friends. It didn't make him less of a psychopath in my eyes, but there's something very sad about watching a man drink whiskey all alone under a bridge at 3 a.m. Throughout the time I spent stalking him, I played it safe and let him continue stalking me as well to not draw attention. I would often catch him looking at me on my way to work, or at the gym, or down the same aisle as me at the store, but I acted as if I didn't notice a thing. The notes continued, but him coming into my house stopped. I continued my normal routine so that when he would run his rounds, I was exactly where he expected me to be each day. One rainy night around 2:30 a.m., I had followed him to this sketchy spot near a bar. Brian paid careful attention to his surroundings that night, making sure he wasn't seen. He had a heavy-looking duffel bag walking across the street and went inside an abandoned warehouse. I parked a little ways away to not draw attention to myself and snuck in. I peeked over the wooden box that I was hiding behind and saw a couple of goons speaking with him, but I was too far away to hear them. He dropped the suitcase in front of them as if expecting something in return. As I tried to listen closer, I made eye contact with the one to the left of Brian. He shouted, exposing my location. One goon picked up the duffel bag. My heart started beating out of my chest. I ran outside and they chased after me. I heard a couple of firearm shots zoom past me. When I got outside, I saw some people around my car, which I assumed were part of their crew, and didn't know where to turn. If I turned around, I might meet my end, and if I ran to my car, they would snatch me up before I could unlock the door, and God knows what they would have done to me. The only option I had left was to head for the woods nearby. They were close on my tail and could hear their footsteps behind me. I ran and ran until my lungs gave out. I eventually was so deep in the woods that they couldn't find me. It had gotten too dark, and the rain hindered their eyesight. I felt a wave of relief, knowing I was still alive. After all of that, I still hadn't found enough incriminating evidence on him, because the shots themselves were worth nothing. Over the months, I collected a disturbing amount of information about him. He wasn't just stalking me, he was involved in some seriously messed up stuff. I found out he had a history of harassing people, and there were even acts of violence in his past. He had secrets he definitely didn't want to get out, and I had the evidence to expose him. The stuff that I found out about this guy belonged on the dark web. I discovered that he had been fired from multiple jobs but always without reason, and there were rumors that he had ties to some sketchy underground groups involved in substance dealings. He was a disturbed man, and I was just one of his many targets. The more I learned about him, the more I realized how dangerous he was. I had to make sure he wouldn't hurt anyone else. I had pages of notes, photos, and recordings of conversations he had no idea I was listening to. I knew where he went, who he talked to, and what he did when he thought no one was watching. It became harder to follow him as much because the time he spent stalking me would often overlap with the time that I tried to get more information on him, and I knew that I couldn't keep getting away with this. I was terrified of what he'd do if he found out that I'd been stalking him for months. Throughout this time, his stalking on me had eased up a little, but the odd note was still placed under my wiper blades. I had to get him to stop, but didn't know exactly how yet. Finally, I decided it was time to confront him. I waited until I knew he'd be alone and cornered him near a private club one evening. My heart was pounding. I told him I knew everything about him. I laid it all out: the harassment, the shady dealings, the violence. I told him I'd share it all online if he didn't back off. For a moment, he looked genuinely scared,